I want to start with a disclosure and a caveat. The disclosure is that I'm speaking on a personal capacity. The caveat is that I am a policy practitioner, I'm not a historian, so I will not try to offer you definitive truths, just maybe a couple of interesting ideas. So today I would like to offer a few thoughts about the links between value, money, and institutions. The first thing I want to talk about is how money is not wealth, is not precious metal, is a social tool which is crucial to facilitate exchange of economic value. And the second thing I want to talk about is how money only really works because it's ultimately backed by the institutions of the state. So let's take the first point first, and I want to explore the links between markets and money. For most markets to function, there needs to be a medium of exchange, and most of the time that medium of exchange is money. But how do we know the value of money? To illustrate, I'm going to show you a photo of some money. This is a coin denominated in pounds sterling. It was minted in 1937. It is a 5-sovereign coin featuring King Edward VIII. So what is the value of this coin? Its nominal face value is £5 sterling. So you could take it to a shop and exchange it for £5 worth of goods or services. But that wouldn't be very wise because this coin is made of gold. And it contains 40 grams of 22-carat gold, which at recent market prices is worth about £2,500. So is that the coin's value then? Maybe, maybe not. And that's because in 2021, a coin just as this one sold at auction for $2.3 million, making it the most valuable sterling coin ever sold. So what is this coin's value then? As we've just seen, it partly depends on what we mean when we talk about value. In fact, as an economist, when I think about money, one of the first things that comes into my mind is the thought that money can act as a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. And those are useful definitions. They explain how money can, at the same time, be the way we measure value, the unit of account, and the way we exchange it in transactions, the medium of exchange. But they tell me what money does, its functions. They don't really tell me what money is. At primary school, my children are learning about money, and they do that by using pictures of coins, and they use them to solve simple mathematical problems. When I studied economics as an undergraduate, there was a tendency to think about the development of money as a commodity medium of exchange used to avoid the need for barter. This is the so-called barter to money myth. And it's a myth because, as has been documented very well, before money existed as physical tokens, it existed as an intangible system of credit and clearing. Ancient civilizations, and we heard a lot about that from the two Davids, were able to transact by issuing debts so that goods were received in return for a promise to pay. Then as formal markets grew across Europe, innovations such as banking led to an expansion in the use of credit for payment. Intangible money has existed alongside physical money for a long time, and over the centuries, in every continent, money has taken many physical forms. Inscribed clay tablets in Mesopotamia, shells in Africa, playing cards in Quebec, or the huge, often talked about, written about, ray stones from the Pacific island of Yap. What is interesting to me is that none of these forms of money that we can see here have any intrinsic or commodity value. They're simply tokens which represent economic value. And since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s, there has been no link between the world's currencies and gold. Fiat money, which is not backed by any physical commodity, is now the norm. So whatever its form, physical or intangible, money is always a form of credit, a liability. In simple terms, money is like holding an IOU, which I believe will retain its value until I pass it on to someone else in the future. And that is why money is better thought of as a mechanism to coordinate social activity rather than a commodity with inherent worth. Money is a social technology used to understand, measure, and exchange economic value. To paraphrase John Stuart Mill, money is a social machine that allows us to do easily and quickly the things that would otherwise be difficult and slow. But for money to have this incredibly useful property, it is often said that it requires users to trust it. I like the idea of trust, but I think we can define it a bit more precisely. Money needs to have two important characteristics. The issuer of the money has to be creditworthy, So users need to know that the economic value that the money represents will be maintained over a reasonable time period. And money needs to be transferable. Users need to know that the vast majority of people will accept it as payment in the future. So markets need money, and money needs to represent economic value. But it does not really matter what the value of money is, as long as it means broadly the same to all users all of the time. My second point today is to say something about the links between money, institutions, and the state. And I will illustrate this by looking at arrangements in the UK, and I will talk about 4 institutions: the Royal Mint, the Treasury, the Exchequer, and the Bank of England. Coins are the oldest form of physical money in England, dating back to at least pre-Roman times. After the Romans, the systematic production of coinage started at various local mints. The Royal Mint sees its beginnings with the large issue of silver pennies bearing the image of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century. This is my picture of one of those pennies. Since then, and up to the present day, the Royal Mint has produced sterling coins for the Crown. Today, the Royal Mint is owned by His Majesty's Treasury, which is the UK Finance and Economics Ministry. The role of the Treasurer, the person charged with looking after the King's treasure, goes back to at least the 11th century, but it's only a few centuries later that the Treasury, as an independent department, really emerges with responsibility for the Crown's finances when it is transferred to a commission of appointees in the 1660s. The Exchequer is another ancient institution dating from the Middle Ages. It issued funds, it received revenue, and it featured the half-yearly audits with a checkered cloth, hence Exchequer, used as an accounting device. And the part of the Exchequer which brought the money in and sent it out is now within the present-day Treasury. The Bank of England has been issuing banknotes since it was founded in 1694, and at the time, the King needed funds to finance the war. The bank gave the government a permanent loan of 1.2 million sterling at a rate of 8%, and in return, the government gave the bank 2 things: the right to set up as a limited company and the rights to issue paper banknotes as legal tender. And this is a really important moment in the history of money in the UK, because it allowed private money issued by the Bank of England to have the endorsement of the Crown, and therefore made it as trusted as the coins that bore the image of the King. It meant that the government and the bank had locked themselves into an enduring relationship, which is still going strong today, all the more so since the bank was taken into public ownership in 1946. So I've talked about the institutions. Let's think now about how they relate to money, and we can do that by looking at the main components of public and privately issued money in the UK today. And this shows that there's approximately £5 billion worth of coins produced by the Royal Mint. That's the little dark blue area. There are £82 billion worth of Bank of England banknotes in circulation. That's the orange area. As a small aside, it's worth pointing out that the small grey area down there, that's the 6 private banks that are allowed to issue banknotes in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and they have about £4.5 billion worth of those banknotes. If you've never seen them, they're very interesting. Here's one. They look completely different to Bank of England banknotes. This one in particular has portrait orientation rather than landscape, which is quite rare. And the issuing banks need to back these notes with Bank of England banknotes. Let's go back to the chart. Then there are the wholesale deposits that commercial banks hold at the central bank, at the Bank of England. They're in yellow. There's the central bank reserves. And that's a form of money which is used in electronic transactions between commercial banks, and there's about £760 billion worth of those. So those are the 3 forms of public money: coins, banknotes, and central bank reserves. But the majority of money is not public. It has been issued by private sector institutions, and that's because by far the largest form of money are the deposits that households and businesses hold at commercial banks, and that stands at 2.2 trillion. But I hear you say, how can this type of money, by far the largest, how can this be linked to the state? Well, even by the 18th century, bank customers considered the deposits to be safe, not because their banks held precious metal against them, but because they were required to hold safe assets like central bank balances or government bonds. And these days, state institutions still safeguard the banking system which issues so much of our money. This happens in a number of ways. In the UK, all deposit-taking institutions need to be authorised and regulated by the Bank of England. The commercial banks need to hold enough high-quality capital to absorb losses in a range of scenarios. They have access to the Bank of England's lending operations should they need liquidity. Retail deposits are also guaranteed by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which is underpinned ultimately by access to government funds. And if all of that fails, there's always the Treasury who can use its financial power to provide credit or liquidity support to a bank in a crisis, just as we saw in 2007 and 2008, and in doing so ensure that money deposited in those institutions retains its value. And that is why, looking at all these different forms of money today, it is possible to trace a line back to the state. All forms of money are either direct liabilities of the state, or they are liabilities backstopped by a contingent claim on the state. Now, I realize I've covered a complex set of institutions involved, but a key point about it is that at the core of all of them is the Treasury, the Finance Ministry. And this is because the Treasury is the sole shareholder of both the Bank of England and the Royal Mint. Treasury ministers appoint the governors of the bank, the chief executive of the Royal Mint, and as well as members of the boards at both institutions. And the Treasury sets the objectives for both the bank and the Mint. Crucially, within this institutional puzzle, the Treasury plays a central but unexpected role when it comes to money, because if money requires faith in the financial backing, then the Treasury has the most powerful financial backstop available, which is its tax-raising powers. It means that the Treasury is able to use the legislative process to increase revenue, including in order to protect the value of our money at a time of crisis. Another way to look at this, or to illustrate it, is to think of money as a liability, like I said earlier, as an IOU. The ability to issue liabilities depends on a range of factors, but primarily creditors' perceptions of risk and return. So if we look at the UK institutions that I've just discussed today, this figure shows their balance sheets, but I have presented them by looking at them from the perspective of their liabilities, not their assets. So if you take the Treasury and the Exchequer together, they have close to 2.5 trillion liabilities in issue, while the wider government has over 6 trillion liabilities, and they're both in net liability positions. And that means that it is governments, thanks to the tax-raising powers of their finance ministries, who are best able to issue liabilities. But that's not the whole story, because the ability for governments to do so depends on a number of other conditions, such as the belief that the authorities will maintain control over inflation so that the value of your liabilities will not be eroded over time, and the belief that society will continue to support the political system so that governments will continue to be able to use taxation to meet its obligations. To paraphrase financial economist Hyman Minsky, anyone can issue money. The problem is to get someone else to accept it. Trust in money comes from its creditworthiness and its transferability. My contention is that these qualities stem from the historical links to the institutions of the state. So those were my observations on money, value, and the role of institutions. But what has it got to do with the Edward VIII coin? I thought you were, yeah, it's coming. The discrepancy between the face value, £5, and the bullion value, £2,500, shows the folly of the conventional view of money as a commodity. As set out today, for money to be able to facilitate exchange, the monetary standard needs to be able to adapt without the constraints created by the precious metal in the coin. And it also tells us something about institutions. The Edward VIII coin shows the value of having to respect them, because one of the reasons this coin has such high value to collectors, 2.3 million, is because Edward VIII broke with the tradition, going back to Charles II, that each monarch's effigy should face in the opposite direction of their predecessor. And that makes this coin extremely rare, but not very good money. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must admit, I got curious when you showed the banknote from Ulster, was it? Yes. How come that right is still around, and are they legal tender?
Great question. Legal tender, as in the UK, has a very narrow definition. Okay. which is that it's currency that you can use to settle your debt in court. Obviously, in public usage, a lot of people just talk about legal tender as, I want you to take this form of money. Would you please do it? And in fact, there's many stories of tourists around Westminster trying to go to the shops and use Scottish banknotes or Northern Ireland banknotes, which no one can even recognize. I think the reason it's continued for so long is for cultural reasons. The truth is, you can go to any financial institution and they will exchange them for Bank of England banknotes. A bigger challenge these days, to be honest, and I was talking to people here about it, is being able to spend cash at all in some places, which I know here in Sweden is a big thing as well.
Exactly. Thank you very much.